What we're going to be exploring is some things that I think are really relevant to the situation at the moment, because as we're making this now, currently we're in the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, and we've seen it really affect people in a couple of different ways. So in relationships, we've seen how suddenly you're stuck at home, or you're stuck in the same place with, if you're in a partnership or you're in a relationship, you're stuck with that same person for prolonged periods of time, and that can be pretty tricky. It can bring up arguments, it can bring up kind of disagreements, or kind of we start to notice things that, we don't like about the other person.
Yeah, I mean, I get this quite a lot in my couples sessions. I get a lot of distressed couples saying to me, I can't cope with this any longer. And now, particularly, there's another month of this coming. We're together all the time. We work at home. We have our partnership at home. We have our children at home, and it's just simply getting too much. So it's really quite difficult to kind of separate our different aspects of life anymore. So we're not going to work anymore. There's no transition, so to speak, traveling home from work and then coming to see your partner, spending time with your partner, and having time away from work or from the family as well. So there is a lot of distress, and what might be really helpful for a lot of couples, paradoxically, is rather than kind of trying to run away from each other and spend more time apart, it's quite helpful to actually create some time in the week when you come together as a couple for the very purpose of being together as a couple. Just discussing what's difficult for you, what you might have been frustrated about with each other. And that in itself, if you've had that conversation with your partner, if you've kind of connected with your partner again, paradoxically also frees you from your partner, so to speak. So you can then also create some time that you spend apart, where you have some agreement that we do need some moments in the week or in the day when we're not actually interacting with each other. We need some time, for example, after work to do something separately, for example, to go for a walk. So you need time apart, that's really important, but you also need time together. And both influence each other. If you've had enough of both, you'd be all right and you'd be more balanced in your relationship.
And I'm wondering, Angela, as well, in terms of the time together, when you spend that time together, if you think it's good to be spending kind of quiet time together or doing activities, what do you think in that time that you spend together might be a really good thing to help kind of build that relationship and kind of cross some of those difficult times?
Difficulties, yeah. I mean, it could be either. It could be, you can experiment with different ways of spending time together. So it might be that you spend the time to talk. So obviously talking is always helpful, particularly if there are difficulties, if there's something that needs addressing in the relationship, if there's been a particular frustration, if the partner's doing something again that is really winding you up. So that needs to be addressed, that needs to be kind of moved out of the way, so to speak. But it doesn't only have to be talking. I mean, it could also be that you spend some time doing something fun together, like, do some dancing, dance around the kitchen table, for example, learn some moves, how to learn the waltz, for example, or do some exercises together. So that in itself could be quite bonding with your partner as well, or make you laugh, because we need to laugh. We need to have some fun in these rather dire times at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking as well, is that, sometimes doing some activities together, just like dancing or any sort of movement together, because where it gets your body moving, it helps you feel better. And also sometimes we're kind of talking, where we've got into difficult situations through talking, sometimes having a different way of expressing ourselves can help to kind of bring us closer. And I think that could be really important.
Absolutely. And when you do talk, then do create some sort of safe space around that, so to speak. So make sure that when you do have a conversation, that you don't overdo it, so that you set aside some time during the week where you want to address something that might be challenging. So don't make it more than 10-15 minutes. And it's really important that both of you have an opportunity to say what they need to say, so that you're both available to each other, that you don't get disrupted by screaming kids, for example, and that you actually make some time to listen to each other, so that both of you have an opportunity to say what they need to say. And that's not always easy, yeah, because a lot of the time we don't listen to each other, do we? I mean, we just want to talk, we want to be, we wait for the partner to kind of rush on and say the piece that we want to say without really taking in what they have to say. So particularly now in these rather challenging times, it's really important that you create that time where you properly listen, where you make some space for each other to express each other, to say what you need to say.
And I was just, in terms of that, because, when we are kind of expressing what we need to say, do you think there are certain good ways to go about that, to introduce that, so we don't suddenly get into like all of our kind of things, we kind of say what's wrong with the other person and kind of what's making us angry?
Yeah.
What if there was one little recommendation you could give people to kind of how to kind of maybe introduce those topics or express them, what do you think might be useful?
Okay, so there are different ways of going about it. So one way might be that you have an agreement that it's only one of you talking, so only one of you talking for say 10 minutes and describing what they're struggling with. So one of you is the talker, one of you is the listener, and the listener doesn't disrupt, doesn't come in, doesn't say, well, but the listener is purely there to take on board what the speaker is saying. And what they can do to amplify this and to indicate that they are taking on board what the partner is saying, they can kind of reflect back what they heard them say. So you talk for 5 minutes, or not actually 5 minutes, might be a bit too long, but just for a minute or so. And then you have a pause as the speaker, and the other person just says, well, what I heard you say is this or that. And that sounds very simple, but actually it's a really powerful exercise, because a lot of the time we don't do that with each other. We just sort of talk over each other. We both get quite agitated. We want to get our piece across, but we're not really taking in what the partner's got to say. So that's one basic exercise, that you can do. It sounds basic, but actually it needs quite a lot of practice. And then there are also some rules, right? So when you have a conversation with each other, when you're frustrated with each other, some rules, for example, that you don't bombard each other with too many issues. One issue at a time. Yeah, so if you're frustrated because your partner never cleans the bathroom properly, then have a conversation about that, but not about a whole host of other issues that you're really angry about.
Yeah, and
that's just one.
Yeah, and just bearing that in mind, I think as well, it's like when you do want to kind of bring some of these things up, it's really useful to think about how you express it, so that when we're saying it doesn't sound too judgmental, like you just don't care about me, or kind of you're so inconsiderate, and just avoiding words like this, and just noticing actually if somebody is, or your partner's doing something that makes you feel like they're not caring about you, finding a way to express it. So it would be something along the lines of I feel X when you do Y. So I feel upset when you leave kind of dirt on the sink or something like that. And kind of just showing how it makes you feel, because when we're expressing actually how it makes us feel rather than judging them, people are more likely to respond. Because as soon as we say you're so inconsiderate, you're so kind of X, Y, Z, it immediately puts up a barrier for the other person, and it starts to get defensive and they don't really listen, and that's where arguments often start. But when we say I feel really upset when this happens, if somebody says they're feeling upset when somebody else does something, we're more likely to want to do something to help them. Absolutely,
yeah. So I statements rather than you over there and what you do wrong. That's really makes such a difference. And also then when you're having a discussion about something, when you're expressing how frustrated you are about something, you don't want to bring up too many things from the past. You don't want to come up with statements like, well, you always, where you then drag up something that the partner has done last week, the year before, 5 years ago, something like that. So focus on something that is relevant for the present only, otherwise it gets too much.
Yeah, and I think one other tip as well, if you do find certain things trigger you off when you're in your relationship and when you're stuck at home all the time, it's about starting to separate what is it that triggers you and what is your response. So, it might be that maybe they leave something lying around, or maybe kind of you think your partner looks at you in a certain way that you think they're judging you, or whatever it happens to be, and noticing what is the trigger, and then how do you respond. And the real key is not getting so caught up in the emotional response that we start to get out of control. Because I'm sure we've all had times where suddenly your partner does something or says something, we feel wound up and we start to kind of get into that angry state. And when you're feeling angry or when you're feeling irritated, suddenly we start kind of expressing it through our words and the tone of our voice and the things that we say, and we kind of lose a bit of control because that almost the reptilian part of the brain kicks in, where we just go into that automatic way of responding, and we often say things that we regret later.
Absolutely. And a lot of the time we do that because we feel threatened. So a lot of the time this expression, as you say, this anger, this rage is really an expression of our underlying fear that our partner doesn't get us, doesn't understand us, might not like us anymore, might not care about us. So frequently we get into these arguments because we feel under attack, so to speak, and we want to communicate to our partner that we're not happy, that we're feeling not cared for, not loved by our partner.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just a quick little tip in terms of something that you can do with that is when you start to think about those triggers, or think about those triggers when you're not in that situation. So start to think back to times where you've been put into this state, or you feel yourself going into this emotional state, and thinking, what is the thing that kind of triggers me into that? Is it the way they say something? Is it a word? Is it a look? What is it about the thing that the other person does that triggers you into that state? And then started to think, well, how can I respond differently? And one way that you can do that is to start to slow down your breathing. Now, I know it sounds like a simple thing, but your breathing is so tied up in how you feel. If you think about times where you feel anxious, or you feel frightened, or if you've ever had a panic attack, those times where, what happens to the breathing? Well, it gets really fast and high up in the chest. We start to breathe more quickly. We usually breathe more from the chest. Whereas times when you're feeling relaxed, if you think about how you breathe then, usually it's more from the diaphragm, it's slower. Your breathing is so linked up to how you feel. And it's a really powerful connection to have more control over your feelings. And I'm not saying it's the only thing. It can't necessarily take you out of the biggest emotional state, but it really can help. So I'd say one of the first things to do is, if you start noticing yourself get triggered into a strong emotion, is tune into your breathing and start to think about slowing your breathing down. Think about breathing from the rib cage. So putting your awareness down around about the rib cage, and techniques that, like things you learn in mindfulness, can be really useful for this. But think about slowing your breathing down, breathing from the rib cage, and maybe breathing in to a count of 3 or 4, and then breathing out to a count of 3 or 4, and just slowing it down. As you do that, after a few breaths, often you'll find that you actually do start to kind of put yourself in a more calm state. It really can help you with those difficult times.
It's really, really helpful, because a lot of the time, particularly when we're feeling attacked by our partner, we get defensive, right? So the shutters come down, we're just going to block off whatever is coming our way, and we're just saying, no, I don't want to hear that. So breathing is a really good way of, when you notice that you're getting very agitated, to kind of control yourself also in response to what your partner is bringing. So when you are agitated, you slow down your breathing, and when you feel like you're under attack by your partner, that person also starts to slow down their breathing. Or another way is just to remove yourself, because it might be appropriate sometimes to just say, well, look, this is too much. I can't cope with this right now. I'm not actually taking in what you're telling me. I don't want to have this conversation about the bathroom right now, because I've got loads and loads of other things on my mind, and now is not the time to discuss it. Can we have an agreement that we postpone it until later in the day, for example, or the next day? And you don't want to leave too much of a gap to address this issue, because otherwise it kind of goes under and it starts to simmer in the background, and more resentment is building. You do want to address it, but maybe not at that point in time. You have to be ready to have that conversation and to be receptive to what your partner's got to bring.